Thank you for joining me for this presentation. Today I'm going to be talking about challenging yourself. My name is Sarah Tencer. I have my master's in social work and my pronouns are she, her, and hers. As a disclosure, I am a presenter being paid by PTC Therapeutics for this content, and I am not a medical professional. In this presentation about challenging yourself, I'm going to talk about two major categories: goal setting and resilience. And talking about goal setting, I'm going to talk about why we set goals, how to get started, and some models about how to go about doing that. And then we'll talk about resilience. We'll talk about what is resilience. Do I have resilience? Why is it important? And how do I nurture it? So first, an overview about goal setting. Why do I need to set goals? Goal setting can have different purposes depending on who we are and what our tendencies are. So it has different purposes for different people. If you're a really visionary person, you tend to be a daydreamer, thinking about the long term, things that you hope and dream for yourself, goal setting can be a way to break that down and put it into actionable steps. So our heads aren't in the clouds, we're actually putting things, pen to paper, foot to pavement, and getting started on things. On the flip side, if you're someone who hasn't really thought much beyond what you're going to eat for dinner tonight, goal setting might be a way to start exploring the direction you want to take your life and putting a little bit of intention behind your actions so that you are moving in a specific direction. The goal of goal setting, per se, is to challenge yourself and to push you outside of your comfort zone, but to do so in an attainable way. And I think it's really important to hold those two things together, the challenging and attainable part, because they're both equally important. If you're not challenging yourself, if you're only setting goals that are easy to accomplish and you're just doing it so that you can check things off your list, I know that it can be satisfying to check things off your list. I'm definitely one of those people. But if that's all you're doing, you're never really going to be pushing yourself into a direction or working towards anything long term. On the flip side, if you're setting really pie in the sky ambitious goals, which are good to do sometimes, but if that's all you're doing, it's possible that you're going to regularly fall short of what that goal is because you're setting that expectation a little too high. And this may work for certain personality types, but for a lot of people, if we're regularly falling short of the goal that we've set for ourselves, we're going to get discouraged and we might even give up. And that can be even if we're making incredible progress towards our goal, but we don't ever actually meet it. And so then we get discouraged. And so holding those two truths, that challenging and that attainable piece together, is going to be really important as we start to think about these models. Where do I start is another common question about goals. And this is something that, again, changes a little bit depending on who you are and whether you're that really big visionary daydreamer thinker, or if you're that really kind of here and now present person that doesn't think much in the future. If you're the first, if you're that really big picture thinker, then where you start is something that may be starting to break down that big thing and start thinking about the next steps. If you're someone who is more of the here and now, hasn't thought very far in the future, there may be some things that you can ask yourself or practices that you can start that help you think about that direction that you want to start going and how you want to start putting a little bit of intention behind your actions. A question that I've heard people ask themselves sometimes is, one day when I'm reflecting on my life, what do I want people to be able to say about me? What are the things that I think it'll be important that people are able to say about me as a person or the life experience that I've had? And then you can start to work backwards from there. Is it important for you that people reflect on your professional accomplishments or your achievements? Do you want people to reflect on the type of relationship they had with you? Do you want people to focus on the experiences and adventures that you went on? And that'll give you kind of a direction that you want to start working towards, whether that's the spontaneous adventure, family-oriented, career-oriented. It can kind of help you start to identify that. Another place to get started is to identify the routines and the ruts in your life. And I think it's really important to identify the difference in these because to an outside perspective, routines and ruts can look kind of similar. They might even look exactly the same to someone on the outside, but the difference comes in your intention and your motivation for that action. So I'll give kind of a silly example. Take someone who eats pretty much the same thing for breakfast every single day. I am one of these people. This could be because I've optimized what helps me feel full for the longest amount of time and really provides as many nutrients as I can. Or it could be that I've never really looked into other options. This is what I've always eaten for breakfast. I've never really experimented with recipes or ingredients or options. And that's kind of the difference between the two. It's a routine if it's something that I've put intention behind. I eat the same thing for breakfast every morning because it's high in protein and fiber. It helps me feel full, and it's something that gives me energy for my morning. Versus the intention of just not really knowing anything different and not really having the motivation to look into any other options. If you've never really set goals for yourself, maybe start with something as simple as that. Identify a rut in your life and then set a goal to help you get out of that. And so maybe it's just infusing a bit of intention in a space that didn't previously have any direction or purpose. And the more we infuse our life and our day-to-day with intention, the more likely it is that we're going to be moving in a direction that's meaningful for us. It doesn't have to be huge. It doesn't have to be a big career step, but just create some intention. So now we'll talk about the models of how we go about actually doing this goal setting. So the first model I'm going to talk about is the GROW model. And GROW stands for goal, reality, options, and will. Goal, obviously this, we've been talking about goals this whole time. The goal is going to be that big picture thing. So again, I mentioned if you're a big picture thinker, this is a good place to start because you check off the first step already. You've already identified that big picture thing that you want. But if this isn't something, maybe it's, you take some time to journal about it and daydream a little bit about what direction do I want to take my life? What are some things that I want to accomplish or things that I want to say that I've done? And let yourself explore that a little bit and then pick one of those things that can be the goal that you're going to talk about. Next, you're going to identify what's my current reality. If you're that big picture thinker and you've been working towards this goal since you were a little kid, you may already be well on your way to achieving that goal. You may have already started taking steps to get there and doing things to ensure that that's part of your future. But if you're not, if this is something that's brand new to you and the first time that you think about this big picture goal is following this presentation, your reality might be pretty far off from where you want that goal to be because maybe you haven't thought about it before, so you haven't already started taking steps. And that's okay too. This reality checkpoint isn't meant to be discouraging or to compare yourself to where you are in relation to your goal compared to how somebody else is in relation to their goal. It's just to make sure that when we're setting those intentions that we're starting from a point of where we are, because that's how it's going to be achievable. The other thing to consider with reality is to be aware of any limitations in your life that may impact your ability to get to a goal. And again, I don't mean this to be in a discouraging way, but we want to set goals that we're kind of set up for, or that we at least have the tools and resources to work towards. So for instance, I already have my degree. I have my work experience. I have a social work degree. I've worked in nonprofits. If I wanted to set a goal of being an engineer, but I didn't really feel like I had the resources to go back to school or to commit to going back, that might be a very challenging goal for me to get to. And that's not to say that I can't set my mind to it or there's not workarounds. But if I don't have the resources to go back to school, then picking a career that not only is different from my current one, but that requires very specific training that I've not received, that might not be realistic for me. And so being aware of what resources you have access to is going to be important in making sure that we're setting goals and setting ourselves up for success. The third part of this GROW model is your options. Some goals are going to have very specific paths that you have to take to get there. If you're interested in being a doctor, you have to go to med school, you have to do these different rotations. There's very specific steps of how to get there. However, there's other goals that we can set for ourselves that are going to be a bit more open-ended, and there's going to be different ways to get there. And so options is your brainstorming stage where you think about what are the different paths that I could take in order to achieve this goal? What are the different ways to get there? There is societal pressure, sometimes family pressure or internal pressure that we have to do things a certain way. I know that I specifically felt this in my late teens and early 20s when I was thinking about my job. Sometimes we feel like that's prescribed for us. And I want you to think a little bit abstractly. We want to have direction, but it's okay if that looks a little bit different. If we want to explore other options, if we don't want to feel like we're confined to this one path, let yourself daydream about that a little bit. Let yourself think creatively. You may come back to that initial thing that you felt pressure to do in the first place because it may be the best option for you. Letting yourself think about it in other terms is going to help you feel more committed to whatever you choose in the long run. And then the fourth aspect of this is the will. What is your commitment? What will you do in order to accomplish this goal? What resources will you utilize? What people will you lean on? Those kinds of things to help you start thinking about what is my next step going to be? And that leads me into the next model. The next model is about SMART goals. So SMART goals are where we take that big picture and we break it down into a bite-sized chunk. And so this is going to be a lot more specific. You'll see here SMART stands for specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and time-bound. So this is taking that big picture thing that you've thought about the different ways to get there, and thinking about what's the first thing I need to do in order to get there. So you've already brainstormed about it a little bit, but this is going to make sure that you have an action step ready. One thing that I want to mention as we're talking about this overview of SMART goals is that once you get down into the meat of it, you start actually doing the work to achieve these smaller goals, the big picture that you're working towards might change. You might evolve as a person. You might develop new interests along the way. You might lose interest in some things along the way. And so that big picture dream that you thought of may start to shift as you start doing these small steps. You might find yourself on a different path. And that's okay. Nothing is set in stone. Once you've thought of what this big picture idea is, you're not obligated to stay with it. And it's okay to change course. But the important thing is that you're constantly reflecting on that, making sure that changing course is what you wanted to do and that you're not just getting off track. But if you're regularly checking in with yourself about this and regularly setting goals and working towards something, if that starts to shift, that may just be a reflection of you shifting as a person. And that's not anything to be afraid of because we all go through it. We all end up shifting and evolving and maturing in different ways than maybe we expected. So if you can anticipate that and not be freaked out if you end up diverting a little bit, that can help you stay focused and make sure that you're being present in what you're setting out for yourself. So let's talk about how to make a goal SMART. I've listed on the screen 3 pretty vague goals that you could set. And we're going to talk through how can I take this vague goal and make it into a specific goal. I'll do a real deep dive on this first one. So the first one that I've set here is I want to go to college. Sounds pretty specific. It's a specific thing you want to do, but it's not a SMART goal. As a reminder, SMART stands for specific, measurable, action-oriented, realistic, and time-bound. So first we'll need to think about each of those components for this idea of wanting to go to college. So to be specific, you're going to want to think about what type of college do I want to go to? Do I want to go to a 4-year university, a community college, a 2-year program? Is my ultimate goal to go to graduate school? Thinking about that so that you know where to get started and kind of where to focus yourself is going to be important. Now, as you make a SMART goal, you may realize that you need to take a step back. Maybe you thought you were at step 3 in the process and you're really at step 2. That's okay. If you get into the SMART part and realize that you don't really have enough information to make it SMART, to make sure that you meet all of these different requirements for a SMART goal, that may just mean that you need to take a step back and you may need to start earlier. So if you haven't identified the type of college that you want to go to or the type of degree that you would want to seek or anything like that, the first part of the SMART goal may be identifying those things. But for the sake of this example, let's say that you already kind of have an idea of the type of college you want to go to. The next thing is to make it measurable. This, again, is going to depend on where you are in the process. If you haven't picked what type of colleges you want to go to yet, the measurable part might be making a list, making sure that you have an idea of what the requirements are for each of the different colleges and kind of where you fit. If you have already identified the type of universities that you want to go to, the measurable part might be submitting the application. If you've already submitted the application, the measurable part could be choosing a college. Wherever you are in that process, make sure that you find a way to measure success, because that's an important aspect of SMART goals, is that we're able to tell when we've achieved them because we've set out that measurable part. So let's say that the measurable part is that you want to submit 5 college applications. So that's the measurable part, is whether or not you've actually completed and submitted them. The action-oriented part is going to be the action of filling it out. So all of the things that you have to actually do. The measurement is going to be the submission itself. And so the action is going to be all of the steps, writing the personal statements, filling out the applications, looking into application fees, things like that, to make sure that everything is taken care of in order to get there. R is for realistic. And this is going to be different depending on who you are. Realistic in regards to universities might be a reflection of whether or not your credentials meet what their expectations are. So things like your GPA or your SAT scores, things like that, where if they have an average number and you meet that number, then that might be a realistic university for you. This doesn't mean that you can't put in stretch goals or, maybe apply to a university that is, a little bit higher than what you would expect to get into. You can still stretch yourself, but make sure that you have those realistic options as well. Another aspect of the realistic part is going to be your budget. What can you afford to do? There's things like community colleges, in-state versus out-of-state, public versus private. There's a lot of things that impact how much a college costs to go to. And knowing your financial situation is going to be important to knowing what you can afford. Knowing what financial aid options are out there are also going to be something to consider. So if you've already known what you can afford, then making sure that the colleges that are on your list fit within those parameters is going to be what makes it realistic. If you get to this part and realize that you don't know what you can afford, that's going to be a telling sign for you that you need to first make a SMART goal about identifying what you can afford and what your financial situation is. And finally, the T is for time bound. So with this example, it's a little bit, given, because a lot of these universities are going to have a deadline that you have to work with. So that's going to be set there for you. But acknowledging what that is, making sure you know what the deadline is, making sure you know the deadline for early admission versus regular admission, things of that nature, and that you're incorporating those into saying what your goal is going to be. So your goal of, I want to go to college, could transition into, I am going to complete and submit applications for these 5 schools that I've already identified as being realistic for me. And I'm going to do all of them by November 1st. Being that specific is going to allow you to know exactly what you need to do. It's going to allow you to know how to measure whether or not you are successful. And it's ideally going to give you an idea of where to get started. So I won't go as deep into these other 2, but I do want to give examples. So the second goal that I've listed here is I want to find my own apartment. If you've never looked for an apartment before, a SMART goal associated with finding an apartment could be, I am going to make a list of 10 apartment complexes in my town and look into the accessibility, cost, and commute of each of those locations. And I'm going to have this list ready by the end of the month. So it's specific. You've given yourself a number to research, and you've said that it's within your town. And so you have a geographic range that you're looking at. It's measurable because at the end of this, you're going to have a list or you're not. And whether or not you have that list is whether or not you are successful. It's action oriented. It requires you to do research and to make the list itself. Ideally, it's realistic. Maybe 10 isn't realistic because you live in a small town and there aren't 10 apartment complexes. Make sure that it's reasonable based on where you live. And then time bound. You're giving yourself to the end of the month. So that would be an example of a SMART goal for finding an apartment. The third one I listed here, I intentionally made this one a little bit more abstract because we can make abstract concepts into SMART goals. It doesn't just have to be really tangible things. So the example I gave here is, I want to be more brave. Maybe when you were thinking about, what do I want people to be able to say about my life? Maybe something that really stuck out to you is you want people to be able to say how brave you were and courageous you were. And so you want to start setting SMART goals for yourself that create intention in your life about being more brave. This is pretty abstract, but you can still make it a SMART goal. An example would be maybe to define what brave means to you. So that could be a good first step, because brave could mean different things to different people. Maybe to you, brave means doing things that scare you and making sure that you're pushing your limits and doing things that are a little outside of your comfort zone, within the realm of reason, still considering safety. But maybe to make a SMART goal around being brave, you first make a list of things that you've always wanted to do, but you've been nervous about trying. And you set a goal around trying one thing on your list every month for 6 months and journaling about it so that you have something to reflect on at the end of that 6-month period. It's specific because you've already made this list, and so you know what you're choosing from. It's measurable because you're journaling about it, and so you have something to look back on, and you have a goal of whether or not you're actually doing one thing a month. It's actionable because it requires you to do something on that list. Ideally, it's realistic because you've identified things that you're capable of doing and that are still, like I said, within that realm of safety while still pushing yourself. And it's time-bound. You're doing it once a month for 6 months. So think about those things that you want to accomplish in your life. And especially if you're someone who thinks about your goals a lot, but you have a really hard time getting started, or you start a project and then you give up halfway, think about incorporating SMART goals into different areas of your life. Maybe just start with one, but as you make it into a practice, you'll notice that your mindset about goals starts to shift, and you no longer start to think, loosely about goals in the future without starting to attach action items to it. That can become a habit for you. And it can be a really healthy one to make sure that we're regularly doing things that are meaningful for us and that we're setting some intention for our life. For more information about either of these two models that I've talked about or goal setting strategies in general, I've included some websites here that can be helpful. So the next section of this presentation, I want to talk about resiliency. And I've put a definition of this on the screen for us, that resilience describes our ability to bounce back and keep going after a stressful experience. As a member of the muscular dystrophy community, you have inevitably encountered some sort of stressful experience related to your diagnosis, which means that you are uniquely prepared to take on new challenges because you've already had to overcome things in the past. So this gives you a starting point. These are maybe experiences that your peers who don't have a disability haven't had to experience, things that they haven't had to overcome, that you can start to reflect on and start to notice what made you strong in that moment, or who did you lean on in that moment, which resources did you use. Because as we're starting on this journey of goal setting and creating intention and challenging ourselves, there will be setbacks. Setbacks do not equate to failure. Experiencing a setback doesn't need to throw you completely off course. It doesn't mean that you failed. Sometimes it's something completely out of our control and we couldn't have prevented it from happening even if we tried. Even if you did have control over it, our ability to bounce back after that setback says a lot more about us than whether or not we experienced the setback at all. Something that could be helpful as you start to reflect on this aspect of your life could be journaling. And I bring up journaling a lot, but I really do think that it's an important practice to be able to practice self-reflection. And in this situation, when you're experiencing a hardship or a setback, journaling about your emotions in the moment, and then continuing to journal after you've kind of worked through it and your emotions, maybe a month later, a year later, whatever that time frame is. Journaling about who was there for you, what resources you utilized, what was helpful for you in that moment. This can be something that if you get in the habit of doing it, once you face a new setback, if you're feeling overwhelmed, you can go back to that journal and look and kind of remind yourself, both I can do hard things, reminding yourself of that, reminding yourself that these emotions of being overwhelmed and stressed, that they don't last forever. You can look and see, I was really overwhelmed when this happened too, and I was feeling a lot better a month later. A month may seem like a long time right now, but reminding yourself that this isn't a permanent state of being, I will not always be this overwhelmed, is going to be really important to maintaining your mental health in that moment. Also, looking at who supported you and what resources were available to you can help you remember, okay, I really should reach out to this person again, or I haven't utilized this resource in a while. Maybe that would be helpful for me again at this time. Because sometimes in the moment, it can be hard to think about that. It can be really isolating to experience a big setback or an emotional situation. And so reminding ourselves that we don't have to be alone, that people have supported us in the past, or organizations have supported us, professionals have supported us potentially, whatever that looks like for you, reminding yourself of what that is so that you can remember to reach out and kind of get out of your head in that moment. Resiliency is something that maybe some people have a little bit more innately than others, but it's something that anyone can develop. And regardless of what experiences you've had till now, maybe you've had to practice resiliency a lot, maybe you haven't. Regardless of where you are in that, it is a muscle that you can nurture. It's something that you can hone. It's something that you can pay attention to make sure that you're equipped for whatever the next setback is. I've included here some tips in trying to make sure that we're incorporating things into our lives that can best prepare us to be resilient when we need to be. The first tip I've listed is to find meaning. And this may sound pretty simple, but it doesn't mean that we have to be passionate about everything that we do in our lives. That's not really realistic. We're going to have to do things that we're not passionate about. But making sure that when we first embark on something, that we acknowledge why we're doing it. What's the meaning? And it could be pretty simple, right? Like if you're not passionate about your job, but you need a job because you need the income, maybe that meaning is that you're able to be financially independent or a little bit more financially stable. Finding that meaning means that when a challenge comes up relating to that, it gives us something to lean on. It gives us a purpose, a reason to push forward for it and to not give up on it. The next thing I've listed is to find support. I mentioned this in the previous slide, but you don't have to do things alone. Being resilient doesn't mean that you have to harbor all of these emotions by yourself and work through it all by yourself. Seeking out support and having that available to you before you reach that setback is going to be important. So that means nurturing your relationships. I am a big proponent of therapy. I think therapy can help lots of people. And I also think that if you have an existing relationship with a therapist, that when you experience a challenge, having that existing relationship can be really helpful because they already know you a little bit. They already know your background. And so you're not having to start from scratch and seeking that out because you're experiencing a hardship. The third thing is to practice managing your emotions. And this is a pretty big topic. I could probably give an entire presentation about managing your emotions. But what I'll talk about here is that when you're experiencing a challenge, it's important to feel that emotion. You know, we don't want to push it away or think that it's bad, that it's not happening for a reason. When we experience emotions, our body's trying to tell us something. And so allowing yourself a safe space to really fully experience that emotion is pretty important. But also being able to pivot into a more strategic mindset is equally important. And so an example that I'll give here is, let's say that you're in college and you're doing really poorly in one of your classes. And it's coming up on the drop period where you can drop a class without any penalty. And you've just been really stressed about it. It's been really overwhelming. You're not used to doing poorly in a class. And so you're experiencing all of these really big emotions about it. And that's okay. You want to give yourself some space to experience those emotions and to really let yourself feel them. However, at some point, you're going to need to start to take action steps to address the situation. So maybe that's meeting with the professor. Maybe that's choosing to drop the class. Maybe that's meeting with an advisor. But being able to experience the emotion, but then pivot into goal setting and making sure that you have a path lined out for yourself is a pretty important skill. And it's not something that comes naturally to most people. It's something that you have to practice. But if you have been acknowledging your emotions and you've been working on goal setting, you have those skills that you can lean back on. And so in the moment, you have something to pull from. You have a tool in your toolbox that can kind of help you with that pivot. The final tip that I'll mention with building up resiliency is making sure that you're taking care of yourself. And I mean this holistically, taking care of yourself physically, emotionally, mentally, really caring for your mental health, making sure that you have good practices around that, making sure that you're having good practices around taking care of your body, whether that's food or exercise, medication, doctor's visits, whatever that is, making sure that you have good routines in your life. So again, when things go wrong, we're better equipped to move into that space because we're coming from more of a healthy foundation. This doesn't mean that you're always going to be in a healthy physical space, mental space, or emotional space when a challenge comes your way. Sometimes life kicks us when we're down and we're already in a bad headspace, and then something really hard happens. Taking care of yourself doesn't necessarily prevent that from happening, but it does mean that, again, we have the tools in our toolbox and we're equipped to kind of get back to that space of taking care of ourselves, or we know what our body needs in order to take care of ourselves to kind of get out of that bad space. So if you know yourself really well and you know which physical practices help you feel better physically, mentally, emotionally, whatever that is, if you're familiar with what's helpful for you, you can start there, work your way out of whatever kind of emotional space you're in, and then be able to move into a strategic space. Each of these things can be really helpful in making sure that we're incorporating practices into our day-to-day life to where when we experience setbacks or challenges, that we're equipped to really deal with those and to move forward and to practice that resiliency. And the more we practice it, the easier it becomes. It doesn't necessarily mean that the situation is easier, but just that we can acknowledge, I've done this before. I know how to do hard things. I know what I need to do to get myself out of this headspace or to get myself into a space where I can start setting goals again or to move forward. For more information about resiliency, I've included a resource here that would be helpful to look into after this presentation. That concludes my presentation. If you have any follow-up questions, please feel free to reach out to me at the email address on the screen. And for additional educational content, you can visit DuchenneandYou.com.